Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Erpelding, and welcome to the sixth installment of In Search of Civility. As I mentioned, my name is Matt Erpelding. I'm the Vice President of Government and Community Relations for the Boise Metro Chamber of Commerce. And I'll be co-moderating today's discussion. But before we introduce our guests and my co-host, I'd like to offer a bit of background on In Search of Civility. In Search of Civility is a unique partnership that grew out of last year's political tumult. And the series is innovative between Smith and Malek attorneys, the Association of Idaho Cities, and the Boise Metro Chamber. And this year, we're committed to having those difficult discussions from representatives of multiple sides of issues to talk a little bit about the importance of civility and the issues that swirl around us in our public discourse. We would be unable to produce high quality content like this if not for our sponsors. Today's presenting sponsors are Dawson Coffee and Idaho Central Credit Union. Additionally, we're also supported by Power Engineers and Erstedt Architects. Their support is critical to expanding our ability to reach new audiences about civility and issues in public discourse. And finally, thank you to our media partners, Idaho Ed News, the Idaho Statesman, and the Idaho Press. They provide us with the platform and audience with whom we have an opportunity to interact. Now, I'm joined today by my co-host, Luke Malek. I'm going to welcome Luke to the conversation. Luke, how are you?
I'm well. How are you, Matt? It's good to see you.
Great. You know, today's conversation is about largely last session and some of the issues that swirled around education budgets, and in particular, the issue of critical race theory. Before we introduce our host, I just wanted to get your take on why this issue is so important and why have we elevated it to this conversation?
Yeah, well, it's a phrase that not many people knew before probably February of this year, but it really has burst onto the scene and has had a wide impact on a lot of different policies. And I think it's a really important discussion to have. We have two great guests today that I think are going to do a really good job of breaking down kind of opposing sides of how to look at this and why it's important and why it is actually having an impact on so many broad areas of policy.
Yeah, I hope it's a good conversation. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our first guest. And Representative Chris Matthias represents my old stomping ground, District 19. He is the only Black member of the legislature, and he made headlines when his floor speech during a debate on the state education budget, specifically around critical race theory, which will be the topic of our discussion today. Representative Matthias is a graduate of Boise State University with a BS in Criminal Justice Administration, and while at BSU, he was a McNair Scholar and the student body president. He is also a proud U.S. Coast Guard veteran with top secret clearance, Arctic Service Medal, and 2 Antarctic Service Medals. He previously served as the Chief Academic Officer for the Idaho State Board of Education and as a former U.S. Senate law clerk. He's received numerous awards and accolades, and he is married to Katie, and they have 2 young children. Now I'll toss it to Luke to introduce Representative Horman.
Well, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Wendy, Representative Wendy Horman. Wendy and I met same time I met Matt Erpelding and Kelly Packer, who's also part of this show when we came in as freshmen in 2013, our first legislative session. And Wendy is still a close friend of mine, so it's my honor. Thanks for being here today, Wendy. Representative Horman is a small business owner who represents District 30 out of Idaho Falls. She's a graduate of Roy High School and holds an Associate of Science degree from Dixie State College, as well as a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science from BYU, Idaho. She's a former Bonneville School Board trustee and former president of the Idaho School Boards Association. She and her spouse, Briggs, have 5 children and 2 grandchildren, and she's a very respected member of the legislature. Happy to have you here today.
Thank you.
Welcome, representatives. We are excited to have you, and we know this conversation is going to be a rich dialogue. But before we get into the meat of it, okay, you're out of the longest session in history with the biggest roller coaster as a person outside looking in. How are you enjoying your summer, and what are you doing now that it's over? And we'll start with you, Representative Horman.
Thanks, Matt. It is so good to be here with such great friends. As they said, we came into the legislature, but Representative Matthias and I go back to his days as chief academic officer at the state board. We both love data. And so we've been good friends since then. It's taken a couple of weeks. I'm not used to having the session recovery be in June. I'm used to that happening in April. But so I'm trying to get things back going here, and I'm taking my sister on a 50th birthday trip next week. So I'm looking forward to that.
And I'll add that every legislative session in my experience has been the longest one ever. So whatever is happening right now is the new standard for me. But my family is back in town after spending some time out of state this winter. They're finally back. We're getting out into the mountains, spending time together, reading books, enjoying the weather, doing all the things you're supposed to do when you have young children. So I'm focused on that.
That's exciting. I've got the first question, and this question is going to be broken out for both of you. We'll start with you, Representative Matthias. The great thing about the Idaho legislature is that it's a citizen legislature. And the citizens that make up that legislature come from such a diverse universe of backgrounds. And I want to start where we want to start at that point, a little bit about your experience growing up. And so, Representative Matthias, starting with you, what was your experience growing up, and what do you think people in Idaho may not understand about what young Black men in particular might experience?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Matt. So I had a fascinating childhood, and people are always really curious about my ethnicity. I was not raised by my biological parents, but my biological father was Black. Our African genes come from West Central Africa, the Gulf of Guinea. So the nations ranging along, from Benin to Nigeria and Cameroon. My mother was of Jewish descent, Central and Eastern European. And so, being Black is my immutable characteristic. And so it's the one that has an outsized influence on my sense of self and how people see me. I'm not a dark brother, but where I grew up in the Bonners Ferry of Vermont, I was pretty much darker than everyone else. And so I've experienced the torment and the hate and the ignorance that you might expect. Every Black person in America, everyone who identifies as Black in America is unique and has unique experiences and is different. But the thing that binds us all together is we have all experienced, sometimes in violent form, that undue prejudice and the latent discrimination, or vice versa, the undue discrimination and the latent prejudice that exists in American society, and that we are trained and experienced to see. I feel fortunate in the one hand that I grew up in a place where I was subjected to my torment really early on, and I now have a heightened ability to navigate institutions that are controlled by white people, and I can do it. I can say comfortably most of the time, and effectively, I hope. And so, to answer your question, I think that every Black person in America has experienced the downside of the social phenomenon called racism that I think too many Americans are unwilling to acknowledge.
And, Wendy, Representative Horman, we grew up in similar communities, predominantly white communities. And so my question for you is, in predominantly white communities, at least in the past, conversations about race may not have been at top of mind. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about if you had any formative experiences, especially when you were growing up, where conversations of race or a person of color may have impacted your worldview and your view moving forward.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. So my background, my ancestors homesteaded Idaho. My parents were Idaho farm kids that grew up in Franklin and Cary. Dad joined the Air Force after he graduated Preston High School and was stationed at Hill Air Force Base in Ogden, and that's where I was born. He met my mom there. She had quit BYU and gone to work there because it was, even then, even in 1953, when tuition was only $75, it was still too much for her. So I'm a first generation college graduate. I went back to school at age 43 to finish a bachelor's degree in political science. But I grew up in Roy, where I had friends who were Black, Asian, Hispanic, disabled. And I think most of us hailed from very modest circumstances. But, we played volleyball together, we sang in the choir, played in the band, did student government together. My mom was very involved in volunteering in my schools, and I followed in her footsteps and became a mostly stay-at-home mom to raise our 5 kids while helping to run our small business. So I started volunteering in Idaho schools in '93, tutoring, doing the IRI back when, it was done by people instead of a computer, and started a fine arts program. And then in 2002, I was recruited to run for the school board. In 2012, recruited to run for the legislature. Some of the data I saw when I was on the board, very troubling to me, but because I had spent so much time tutoring, I had a deep concern for students who struggled for various reasons. And that's the only reason I ever ran for public office in the first place, was to make sure all kids could get an excellent education, and I'm still working on that.
All right. Well, thank you both for that background, and I think it frames us well for a conversation we're about to have, which is about critical race theory, or CRT, as it's commonly referred to more and more. So many people don't really know what that means. In fact, it's already popping up in the comments. That's not what CRT is. What is CRT? Regardless of whether people think they are for or against CRT being taught in schools, particularly K-12 or even public higher ed, public schools, we need a definition of what that is. So I'd pitch that to both of you. How do each of you define what CRT is? I'm happy to let either one of you go first there.
Yeah, I'll actually go ahead and jump in first. As the lowest ranking member of the super minority, I don't get a lot of opportunities to jump in and say, I want to go first, but so I'll take this rare opportunity to do it. I will preface my answer, however, with this caveat. I am not an expert on critical race theory. I happen to be a person of color who is really interested in it. I happen to have a PhD in the social sciences, and you cannot have a PhD in the social sciences unless you have some basic understanding of the most, the best defended and widely utilized academic theories that exist in the social sciences, and critical race theory is certainly one of those. To answer the question, I don't think it's helpful to just cut and paste an academic definition of it. So I think for the purposes of this conversation, and the definition that I use, just walking around the neighborhood with my neighbors, is it's a lens. Critical race theory is a lens that puts the social construct of race right at the center. And then that lens can be used to analyze social phenomena, social institutions, criminal justice policy, housing policy, things like that. It's just a way to provide additional and alternative perspectives to otherwise traditionally and widely adopted narratives. I think that's a helpful definition.
And Representative Horman?
I agree with Chris. I am no expert on critical race theory, and I don't have a PhD in the social sciences. I have a bachelor's of arts in political science, and it was not part of my studies. But it is a legal and academic theory that has recently escaped the ivory tower, if you will, and made its way into popular use in politics, government, corporate training, public school worlds. And I had to Google it too during session to find out exactly what it was. So I read from Ibram Kendi, and he asserts that the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. And he sees it that there are only two categories: the oppressed and the oppressors. Nicole Hannah-Jones, author of the 1619 Project, is a journalism that the Biden administration is promoting, and she wants white Americans to stop being white. And we've got Robin DiAngelo, author of White Fragility, that also sees it through a lens of white identity is inherently racist. And You know, you will not hear me argue that America hasn't had its share of past sins or institutionalized racism, nor should we whitewash our history. But I don't think future discrimination is the answer to that. I think that we can have diversity without division, and that we can lead by listening to understand each other's life experiences. And there are a number of other curricular options out there that specifically teach racism or how to discuss it without kind of the blaming part that some people see in CRT.
Well, thank you both for that, and I just want to say thank you both for tackling this. Is a really tough issue, obviously, and you can see that the comments are already heating up there. So I appreciate you guys both taking the time and taking this slowly. And one of these comments actually sticks out to me and ties into our next question. So if you're not experts, why are you expounding on this? But I think it's important that people know that this, even though you aren't experts, this has really taken over, right? And the words critical race theory have significantly impacted the legislature this year. Initially, both the public education and higher education budget was killed over, quote, CRT. The $6 million in early childhood education failed to pass the legislature. CRT was the driving force behind all of these debates. So Representative Horman, should Idahoans be concerned about critical race theory or CRT, and why?
You know, I think we should. My expertise, as I talked about, is basically 30 years of experience from the trenches of tutoring to local governance and state policy making. And so here again, I'm going to lean on folks who have a lot more experience than I do with what this might mean for our public schools. This is Black author Charles Love. When he says the 1619 Project seeks to redefine and undermine the very notion of America. Again, his words, not mine, but you hear the potential harm to public schools in that. You've got parents in other states where this effort is further along than in Idaho. Keisha King, a Florida mom, you know, telling my child or any child that they are in a permanent oppressed state in America because they are Black is racist. And this is not something we can stand for. A mom in Virginia, CRT is not a nice dialogue, it's racist. And we don't want your political advertisement to divide our children. So these are the voices of Black parents, and I listen to that. And we are also starting to see some evidence emerge about damage to students. There's a biracial student in Las Vegas who has actually sued his school district over this because he was being compelled to confess privilege as part of an assignment. And he asked for an alternative, but the school refused to give him one. And they gave him a D. And even though the school district eventually changed his grade, he and his Black mom sued. And so Congress passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 because it became clear that some states would not enforce the 14th Amendment. And it's now becoming more clear that the federal government is choosing not to enforce certain aspects of the Civil Rights Act. So I think we're seeing an inverse reaction here 60 years later, where states are responding with legislation that basically restates what's already in our own Constitution and the Civil Rights Act.
Thank you, Representative Horman. And Representative Pious, so you're a Black man, and that's you've heard Representative Horman's perspective on this, and so same question to you: should Idahoans be concerned about CRT, and why?
The answer is no. The answer is no, they shouldn't be. At this point, my suggestion would be, and this is certainly what I would and used to say to my students, both at the graduate and undergraduate level, is, go back and read Derek Bell and Lonnie Guinier. Go read Professor Delgado, and let's talk about the theory itself. Let's not talk about the extent to which some people have been able or unable to apply the theory to certain situations, curriculum, instruction, institutional reform and things like that. But I just want to back up for a second and put a couple of what I think are important points into the public discourse. The first one is that what's really interesting about critical race theory is that if you track the academic discourse on the theory itself, the longest running criticism of critical race theory is this, that critical race theory is one of the only academic theories that doesn't just try to explain our social situation, it tries to do something about it. And because of that, because critical race theorists stick their neck out into public discourse, it essentially is offering, or the individuals themselves are offering themselves up for public criticism. So the fact that we are criticizing critical race theory doesn't surprise me, because we've been anticipating this for decades. The other important piece about this is that one of the reasons I think critical race theory is so difficult for so many to discuss, comfort levels aside, is because there's really no, widely accepted vernacular or nomenclature to rely upon. For example, discrimination. I hear the word discrimination come up a lot. We just heard how Kendi used the word, and I think it's important to distinguish discrimination with a little d from discrimination with a big D, because discrimination with a little d is something we do all the time in this country, and we are totally comfortable with it. Discrimination with a little d is when we prejudge people based on some characteristic, and then we treat them differently based on that characteristic. For example, if you're too short, you can't ride on the roller coaster. If you're not 21, you can't be a member of the Idaho House of Representatives. No shoes, no shirt, no service. That's discrimination. That's okay. It's undue discrimination that needs to be the focus of our wrath in this state, in this country. And I think we need to do a better job as we facilitate this discourse and nurture it, that we make sure we're distinguishing discrimination from undue and unfair and unjustifiable discrimination. So with that, to answer your question, Luke, I think, my take on this is that we say we are talking about critical race theory. What we're really talking about, though, is how well people are applying that theory to particular situations. We're not really talking about the authors who have written peer-reviewed research themselves. We're talking about how other people are applying that theory to particular social phenomenon. And just for those who are unfamiliar with Kendi, just a pitch for him. If you haven't read his 2016 primer on the definitive history of racist ideas in America, a book called Stamped from the Beginning, I highly advise you take the time to read that book.
Thank you, Representative Matthias. And Representative Horman, I'm going to go back to you, because you did vote against the education budget and wrote op-ed about your concerns with issues like CRT. So if indeed we have a problem, and be it either with this being taught, or Representative Matthias talked about discrimination, what's the solution? How do we move forward?
Well, I think non-discrimination is the solution, and that's the name of the bill. Dignity and non-discrimination in public education. I see it as a protection for Idaho schools from becoming the next political and cultural battlegrounds that we see happening in other states. It does reaffirm freedom of instruction, belief, inquiry, speech, association. It does not forbid teaching about racism or socialism, communism, or any other ism. In fact, it doesn't even forbid teaching critical race theory. And some people didn't like it because of that. But talking about racial discrimination in a classroom is completely different than practicing racial discrimination in a classroom, compelling speech. And that's where it draws the line. It does forbid compelling students to personally affirm, adopt, or adhere to ideas that any one sex, race, religion, color, ethnicity, national origin is superior or inferior to another, and that a student cannot be adversely treated on that basis, or that they are personally responsible for actions of groups in the past. So this bill really is Idaho's statement that we will not tolerate or spend money on discrimination. and that we're reserving education policy and curriculum choices to the state and local institution. I have seen some press reports about the bill that says it allows the state to withhold funds. That's incorrect. Some outlets have corrected that reporting, others have not, but the bill does not do that. It will be up to teachers, parents, students to determine if they see a problem. You know, if parents are finding their students are being forced into compelled speech regarding race, as is happening in California classrooms as young as 3rd grade, then they need to take that up at the local level. If it's not happening in Idaho schools and universities, then nothing will change. If compelled speech or discrimination is happening, then something should change.
Representative Matthias, do you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I agree that, you know, forcing students to embrace certain beliefs or opinions is totally inappropriate. I don't think that that is where the on-the-ground conflict arises, though. I think what has happened is that we have taught or educated or indoctrinated enough of our children to believe that racism doesn't exist. And in fact, I would like to just read, I just read this in the newspaper yesterday. This is what I call kind of the great myth, that pretending racism doesn't exist, that merit and sloth or excellence and pathology explains away racial imbalance, that it's viewed as egalitarian and unifying. Fancy words for the following. Black people get scooped up in our criminal justice system at disproportionate rates. People who have been taught that racism doesn't exist, therefore believe that Black people are predisposed to criminality, but all of the peer-reviewed evidence, when you control for all the variables, poverty, family structure, education, is pretty clear that Black people are not predisposed to criminality. So the question that a critical race theorist asks, and these people ask it all the time, is why do we scoop up so many Black people into our prison system and into our jail pipeline? I conclude, because I subscribe, I find critical race theory to be generally persuasive when applied appropriately. I think there is systemic racism in America. Back to the point, I think a lot of people find that uncomfortable. They've been taught that it doesn't, and when a professor or a teacher tries to convince them that it has been, that they feel they are being forced to accept an opinion that they don't believe with. And I think that's where the conflict arises. It's not necessarily, you know, are white people better than Black people or vice versa? It's, does systemic racism exist? I think when you follow the evidence, I think the answer is yes.
Representative Horman, I'm going to follow up on something you said because I'm a teacher and I compel speech all the time. I make students write papers about research that we are studying. I make them question their position in society, and I have them write papers. That's compelling speech. And the conversation that we're having is that teachers shouldn't be able to compel speech. And I'd like you to clarify what you mean by that, because to your point, it's one thing for a teacher to say, if you don't believe in this, you're getting a bad grade. It's another thing for a teacher to say, why or why not do you not think this has value? And describe it and put it in a paper. Like, that's kind of academia. So and it's in high school. I mean, I went to Catholic high school and had to read Brave New World. A nun prescribed Brave New World to my reading lexicon. That was a whole different universe. So tell me a little bit more about this concern about teaching and compelling speech in schools.
So I think one of the key comments you made, Matt, is why or why not? You can absolutely ask those types of questions. Why or why not do you think white privilege exists or systemic racism exists? The question is entirely different if you have to answer, why does white privilege exist? That indicates a presumption that a student may not agree with. And again, teaching about racism is a completely different proposition than teaching racism. And that's what many Black parents assert that CRT does, is that they're actually, their Black children are being taught to feel inferior to whites as a race. And that's what the bill forbids.
Well, thanks for that answer. I'm going to follow up with you, Representative Matthias, because I want to talk a little bit about the introduction you said, which is critical race theory is a lens at which you can look back at history from and put race at the center. So let's just talk a little bit about some historical things that have come up in the context of critical race theory. Pat Mack, he just put a comment up that's exactly where we want to go on this. And that is, you know, if you use critical race theory to look back at why the South put up monuments to Civil War generals and Civil War leaders through critical race theory, how is that interpreted? And then the second piece is increasingly Juneteenth has become a piece of our history, something that America on the whole is beginning to actually look at and respect. But for the longest time, it was essentially swept under the rug. So if you could talk a little bit about those two issues in particular as it relates to critical race theory, how critical race theory might view it and its relevance, I think that might be helpful in adding context here, because many people say that you're erasing history if you talk about some of these Civil War monuments, which is what Pat Mack just wrote. And so let's clarify, let's have a conversation about what that means to other communities.
Sure. Great question. Important topic. It comes up a lot. I mean, let's be honest. You can't erase history. You can erase certain tellings of it, or you can modernize certain tellings of it, but you can't erase it. Either you know about it, that it happened, or you don't know about it, but it happened. The monuments, for example, a fair critical race theorist analysis would conclude that when you look at a monument to a Civil War general, for example, that it's reasonable for a Black person to conclude, well, that person was a terrorist to me. Maybe they weren't a terrorist in the eyes of America, but they terrorized me. They committed political violence against me. That's what terrorism is. So a critical race theorist would ask, in the context of that past terrorism, was their contribution to our community or our state so great that we should erect a monument to them? That's an important discussion. Those are the types of questions I like to talk about around a cup of coffee. Now, I've had that conversation with a lot of people, and a lot of people will say, well, what about Abraham Lincoln? He was a racist. He's on record as having said that Black people are inferior to white people, but we have monuments to him. I think if you step back and you do the totality of analysis, you will conclude, yes, he was racist. He harbored racist ideas, but he has no real record of terrorizing Blacks. Yes, he deployed troops that in some instances terrorized Black people, but it wasn't in his genetic DNA to terrorize Black people. So a critical race theorist could argue having monuments to Abraham Lincoln, even though he was racist, is still fair in the context of American society. You know, when you look at, Juneteenth, the Tulsa Massacre, Juneteenth is famous for what happened in Texas, the Tulsa Massacre in Oklahoma. And I'd actually like to pivot, because those lands were occupied by the original Americans before any of those people were there. And I think a critical race theorist would use as an example, let's talk about the Sand Creek Massacre. In the late 1800s, the mid 1860s, in the southeast corner of Colorado, a lot of textbooks, if they even write about it, call it the Battle of Sand Creek. The military historians, refer to it as a military battle over aggressive American Indians. But a critical race theorist, someone who is involved in looking at critical Indian theory, would actually make it pretty clear. And anyone who does that research knows that the Battle of Sand Creek was actually a Sand Creek massacre. The American military had signed a treaty with some tribes, multiple tribes, and then totally breached the contract, breached the treaty, and went in and slaughtered a bunch of, we're talking about hacking limbs off babies, rape, genital mutilation, taking slaves and selling them to Mexican bounty hunters. There was nothing honorable about it. But the fact that we call it the Battle of Sand Creek and not the Sand Creek Massacre gets right to this point. who is telling our history? Why is it framed a certain way? And if other people who might not have been the victors at the time had the opportunity to contribute to a fuller telling of that history, what might it look like? Now, this is where another one of the rubs arises, I believe, because I've heard the claim that, critical race theory is racist and that it teaches people to hate America. I think that is a weakly drawn conclusion from a very real predicament when we're talking about this. I think a fear that many people have, especially people on the political right have, is if you teach children, especially white children, about the true history of the Sand Creek Massacre, for example, or what some Civil War generals did to Black communities, that those children, they might, and let's admit it, probably might draw slightly less favorable conclusions about America. And if they draw less favorable conclusions about America, they're less likely to be hyper patriotic. As a military veteran, I have a serious concern about that as well. I mean, that is a legitimate concern, that we don't want to teach children to hate their country. But again, critical race theory, no critical race theorist, no peer-reviewed critical race publication has ever argued that we should hate America. So to answer your question, I think, to come up to 40,000 feet, there's a way that we can tell American history in a more inclusive and representative way. And while it might run counter to the traditional narrative of American history that we've been given, I err on the side of truth and reconciliation. And I think that can only make our country stronger. And I'll leave it with this, and I've said this to my wife before, I feel the same way about this country as I do about my wife. I would take a bullet for both. But I also have an obligation to let them know when I think they're wrong, when I think they're making bad decisions, and have difficult and uncomfortable conversations so that we can get to a better future. And my wife and I have those conversations all the time. And that's why I'm thankful to Representative Horman for being here, because this is how we move America towards a more just and brighter and inclusive future.
Well, Representative Horman, I have the next question, but did you want to respond to that at all before I moved on?
No, I agree with Representative Matthias. We need to have these conversations. And they're important to have. They're important for our students. Again, whitewashing history is not the solution, but nor do I think future discrimination is as a solution to past discrimination.
Well, and this is, we're having a very vigorous debate here, but I will take a little bit of a privilege here and just say it's pretty amazing. We are having a robust debate about a really difficult issue that is impacting a lot of different aspects of our policy making. But I think we agree that, that you can feel the love of country and the aversion towards the more despicable things that have been in our history that have overshadowed some of this stuff. So again, I just want to interject and say thank you again for delving into this. I know it's very difficult. And with that, the next question is, part of the hang up with talking about this issue seems to be that most Idahoans try to be good people and treat everyone equally. And some of the rhetoric can sound pretty accusatory, as though all white people are racist. When we talk about systematic racism, though, it's much more than individual attitudes and prejudices. Representative Matthias, you talked about this a little bit, but can you talk about what you mean by systematic racism versus individual prejudice?
Yes, absolutely. Individual prejudice is just that. It's how we as people, as individuals, prejudge others based on some characteristic that we perceive others to possess. I have individual prejudice. I think we should all be able to admit that we all have individual prejudice. The problem is that when each of these individual bits of prejudice unintentionally roll up into this more pernicious system of racism, it becomes systemic in the sense that this system doesn't require any one person to perpetuate it anymore. It will exist unless enough of us are attentive attentive enough and willing to do battle with it. So, making sure that we raise our children to do their best to make sure that they acknowledge when they have individual prejudice and when that prejudice might be undue, so that they can be more cognizant in how they interact with people in their lives. I think that will undermine the ability of a systemic system to sustain itself. So I think the important point here is that systemic racism exists, and it doesn't require any one person to be the master administrator of that division. It exists because we all have individual pieces of prejudice that a lot of us are unwilling to acknowledge, and they all roll up into this bigger system.
We lost Wendy for the moment. We've got an internet challenge, so I'm going to pop her out of here, Chris. But I want to ask a little bit about when we talk about systemic racism. I want to acknowledge the first thing: it doesn't require any one person to be racist, but rather, at the time when a structure was created, there were racist concepts that were being imported into that structure. So while we're waiting for Wendy to get back on, let's just talk briefly about access to buying a home from 1950 to 1975. Talk a little bit about how that impacted the African-American community and how it still impacts the African-American community from the perspective of inheritances and other things. And then once we get Wendy back on board, we'll get back on track.
Great. Yeah, I mean, anyone who has read the book Color of Law knows that the United States government, many of its agencies, many state governments, intentionally through redlining and other, official government policies, essentially put people of color in certain parts of neighborhoods where housing stock was of lesser quality, and put white people in the more valuable housing stock. And then what we did is we created a social system that is highly contingent on the value of your home, schools, policing, and things like that. And now, multiple generations later, as we've divested from our public safety nets, the middle class in America has most of its retirement in its housing. So it's not a stretch to go back a couple of generations and conclude, if we put certain people in the less valuable housing, and then we create a system that will not give them benefits greater than the value of their home, we know who's going to have the more valuable benefits. I'd like to step back for a minute and kind of paint what I have always found to be a more helpful picture. I always think of, the nature of racial injustice in America. So many people on the call might remember back in the 1990s, MTV used to broadcast this annual event called the Rock and Jock basketball game. It was like a celebrity basketball game once a year, and it was crazy. They didn't follow the normal rules of basketball. Some people could travel, for the last minute of the game. They'd lower a basket from the ceiling, and if you made it in that, it counted as 30 points. It was crazy. But if you think about American history, there's really a lot of similarities between the way white Americans were allowed to navigate American society and rock and jock basketball. I mean, until the passing of the 14th Amendment or the Voting Rights Act, depends on what you see as a demarcation point, white people were allowed to do things that people of color were not. And at some point, let's call it halftime of the game, the American people were like, this isn't fair. This isn't right. We can't allow the white people to have the 30-point basket anymore. We can't allow white people to travel undeterred. We need to bring some equality to the system. Subsequent to that, and there are two struggles that we have now in America. The easier one for us, I think, is this treating everyone equally. That's a no-brainer. And to Representative Horman's point, yes, discriminating against one another to remedy past discrimination isn't a fix if we're trying to promote equality. But we also have to remember that when the two respective teams came out of the locker rooms at halftime, the white people were up by over 1 million points. So there was inequity built into the second half of the game. So a lot of us struggle not just with equality, but equity. How do we create a system where Black kids can live in a house that is going to valuate enough that they can retire? How can we have enough schools that can fund themselves when so many of their students and families are people of color who live in substandard housing stock? These are the inequities that are built into the system. And I think we've all seen the meme of the three children looking over the fence of a baseball stadium, but the three children are different heights. And so they each get different number of blocks to prop them up to see over the fence. And that calibration, how many blocks should everyone get, is the type of discrimination that I think Kendi talks about. The question needs to be, is it undue discrimination? Is it unfairly treating people for something that isn't, well tailored to this characteristic that we think is important? So the inequity versus the equality discussion has kind of been this historical baggage that we've been carrying. And I think the more we can do to parse those out, the better off we'll be.
Representative Horman, when we were in office, we often talked about how traditionally all politics was local. But increasingly with social media, with websites that are focused on national news and all these other things, it feels to me like we're trending toward all politics is national. And so when you look around the country, you have multiple state legislators that are all taking this on as well. They're talking about CRT as being a threat and endangering folks. Now, the language in the bill that you sponsored and passed was fairly innocuous, minus the part that it implied that CRT taught the opposite of those things. So my question for you is this: what do you say to those folks who are out there basically saying that this fear of CRT is nothing more than a GOP boogeyman that is being used to try to use social issues to a political advantage?
A couple of points. One, Chris and I love to talk about that graphic he described with extra supports for students who need extra help. And I love that visual because I've worked on a funding formula in Idaho for years to try and get that to be a truth in this state. And we have a long way to go on that. Second, I would say, there are Republicans who support and oppose CRT. There are Blacks who oppose and support CRD. I mean, James Carville, a Democratic strategist, is on record as saying, wokeness is becoming a problem for the Democratic Party, but nobody will talk about it publicly because they don't want to be canceled. I've quoted some of our Black brothers and sisters earlier of parents who were concerned. But I think one of the most poignant statements about CRT that I found was from Dr. Wyatt Walker, Chief of Staff to Dr. Martin Luther King. He was with King for the march and the I Have a Dream speech. And he said, today, too many remedies such as critical race theory, the increasingly fashionable post-Marxist approach that analyzes society as institutional group power structures rather than on a spiritual or one-to-one human level, are taking us in the wrong direction, separating even elementary school children into explicit racial groups and emphasizing differences instead of similarity. His answer is that we go deeper than race, deeper than wealth or gender, and that we teach ourselves to comprehend each person as a symbol of not as a symbol of a group, but as a unique individual with a shared humanity. And that statement is beautiful to me. I could go on with other statements, but I think I've made the point that to me, this issue is about something much larger than ideology or politics. It's the height of inhumanity and incivility to presume that someone's moral character is determined by their skin color. And I see that as dehumanizing. So in general, polarization or extremes on either end of the political spectrum, they just don't serve us well.
Sorry, I didn't mean to bring us back to the large group too quickly, but there's still some concern about how this was handled in the legislature, and in particular, the rhetoric. This year, the legislature was flush with resources, and higher education ended up taking a $2.5 million haircut and claims of indoctrination were a large part of how legislators were communicating to the public that higher education is behaving. And the reason I bring that up is because when that type of rhetoric is used in an environment, much of which has now been shown to probably not be true, and also knowing that universities have a lot of teachers. And in any environment, you have great teachers and you have teachers that aren't very good. And so claiming that higher education institutions in Idaho are indoctrinating students, what does that do to those critical students, those first generation students that we know need to go to college to be able to be successful as our economy changes? What does that do to them as they're listening to the news, and won't this lower participation in higher education?
I don't like the word indoctrination. I didn't use it in the bill. It's not in 377, and nor did I ever use that word in my debate. In fact, I didn't even use the word critical race theory in my debate. I wouldn't have put it even in the bill, because as I said just a minute ago, to me, this is something. It's about our humanity. It's not about any particular curriculum or pedagogy. But in terms of, a lot of legislators from both parties worked on this bill, though, and it is compromise legislation, and people had a lot of different reasons on other sides, on all sides of this issue for voting yes or no. But in terms of higher education participation, I think issues of cost and flexibility, not to mention a shrinking birth rate, which is going to automatically decrease enrollment. In fact, if we weren't counting dual enrollment students in Idaho, we would be seeing significant drops in our overall enrollment in higher education. So I think we have a number of issues to resolve that are going to help our students be successful in higher education.
One quick follow-up on that, and building off of what Representative Matthias had to say, is I think we're all in agreement. And that's one of the beauties of having conversations amongst the civil group and working on it through the concept of civility. I think we're all in agreement that recognizing the individual for their individual worth and their individual value is critical to moving our country forward. One of the arguments against critical race theory is that it doesn't do that on an individual level, which may or may not be true. But what critical race theory really focuses on are those systemic policies that were put in place years ago that need to be reformed to effectively address issues of equality and equity in the United States. What would you say to a young person of color who is asking for laws to be changed to better address the ability to recognize and grow with an individual's contribution?
I would sit down and listen to them. Again, talking about racial discrimination in a classroom is completely different from practicing racial discrimination in a classroom. And we're seeing examples of that around the country. That's not what we want to happen. In fact, we have some fantastic teachers in the state. I shared this story on the House floor. My son had a history teacher, and he was home practicing piano one day, and all of a sudden he stopped and he said, Mom, Mr. Dyrich isn't a history teacher. He's a future teacher. He's teaching us about history so we can change the future. I think that's what we all want. That's what we want to see happen here. There's a Churchill quote. He talks about he'd been ignored all through World War II, warning about the Nazis. And when he was finally made prime minister to try and solve the catastrophe they were in, he said, of this I am quite sure. If we open a quarrel between the past and the present, we shall find that we have lost the future. So trying to solve these problems by alleging blame or using discrimination is not going to move us forward. And I think there are ways to talk about that. Many legislators, Republican and Democrat, contributed to Idaho's solution. And I hope it is taken as a message from the legislature that we want our schools to be places where all children feel safe. They all feel valued. They all feel appreciated for who they are, regardless of what they bring to the table or what color their skin is.
Matt, is it all right if I wrap it up with the last question here? All right.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So I just have a quick question, and this can go for both of you, but Representative Horman, I'll ask you first. Did we achieve good policy this session?
You know, from my perspective, I think we did. There were a lot of legislators, Republican and Democrat, who worked on that language in the bill. And I mean, I was in constant contact with Representative Matthias, Representative Nash, Senator Ward Engelking on this issue. And, you know, ultimately, and this is the way the process works. Even if people vote no, that doesn't mean that, you know, they didn't participate in discussing and drafting it. Ultimately, it didn't quite get to where Democrats supported it, but it did get to where all members of the Republican Party could support it. And that's not even gun and abortion bills had that this year. You know, the leader of my church said yesterday, he was in a meeting with the NAACP, and he said, we need to abandon these attitudes and actions of prejudice toward any group and respect all of God's children in public, in private, in our own hearts. And that, I think, is the moral character that Dr. Martin Luther King mentioned when he taught us to dream. And I think that's what we want out of this bill. That's what we want out of this conversation that we're having.
Thank you. And Representative Matthias, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, sure, Luke. I can't imagine that you will ever find the lowest ranking of the super minority say, yeah, we passed you know, a lot of good policy this session. But I will say this. I am, having worked for the State Board of Education before, having worked for Boise State University, I am interested in exploring policy that holds the institutions accountable for things that matter most to most people. I think more of the legislature can come together to figure out not how to hold the institution's feet to the fire off some, you know, unmeasurable, egregious conduct around critical race theory. I think we can all come together and draft legislation that will hold our institutions accountable about their 4-year and 6-year graduation rates. I think we can come up with policy and statute around how can we make sure that more of our high school students who are taking dual credit courses are making sure to take the right courses that roll up directly into their degree programs. I hope that legislative leadership really tries to stop managing this situation and start leading by getting us to focus on real higher ed accountability. I think we can get there. And I know that if we do get there, the Representative Horman will still be doing her homework, which I've always appreciated.
So the title of our program is In Search of Civility. And to tie this all back, we chose a very difficult topic and appreciate you, both of you, putting yourselves out there on this topic. So thank you again. But from your perspective, what is the role of civility and bipartisanship in good policy? Representative Horman?
You know, in spite of the fact that, you know, not everybody agreed on the bill, I actually think it's a good example of a lot of legislators talking and working until we could get to some level of agreement. We just have to sit down and recognize. I mean, Representative Matthias and I have already started that conversation. We got together in Boise, what, Chris, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, and already started that conversation on what actual accountability for higher education might look like. He's a brilliant academic that way, and has so many good ideas and technical skills on how we get there. And I think that's how you get to good policy. That's how you talk about and solve difficult problems. And I look forward to continuing to do that in my service with Representative Matthias and other members of the legislature.
And Representative Matthias, will give you the last word. What is the role of civility and bipartisanship in good policy?
Yeah, you know, we are fortunate that we live in what I think is the greatest nation in the history of the world, because we have a social contract in the United States Constitution that is revered around the globe. And the reason it's revered is because we are willing to work with one another, to overcome disagreements, to preserve the key fulcrums in that Constitution that minimize violence against, you know, minorities, that minimize violence against people who speak out against the government. Civility is the key to maintaining our social contract. There is no global police force that's going to come in, or global court that's going to come in and say, you're right, Representative Horman, you're wrong, Representative Matthias, or vice versa. It is the ability to constructively and civilly navigate difficult conversations and get to yes, no matter how small the baby steps are, that are the key to good policy. And so I know we can get there, and I appreciate Representative Horman joining today.
Thank you both, Representative Matthias and Representative Horman, for joining us for this very important discussion today. I think your presence here today proves that it's so much easier to focus on solutions if we take a moment to recognize where we actually agree to begin with. So thank you again. We'd also like to thank our partners, the Association of Idaho Cities, the Smith-Malek Attorneys, and the Boise Metro Chamber. Thanks to our media partners, Idaho Ed News, the Idaho Statesman, and the Idaho Press, and our incredible presenting sponsors, Dawson Taylor Coffee Roasters and the Idaho Central Credit Union. Additionally, thanks to our sponsors, Power Engineers and Ørsted Architects. Be back next month with another edition of In Search of Civility. Thanks for seeing us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.